Before the word, and before the light that gave the word form, there was the deep. It was not an absence, but a presence, not a silence, but the potential for all sound held in a state of impossible, eternal tension. Imagine a darkness so profound it was a substance, a velvet fluid that pressed upon itself from all directions, its own gravity, its own law. This was the primordial state, the undreaming slumber of existence itself. Within this boundless, breathless ocean of what was not yet, a thought began to stir. It was not a thought of language or image, but a vibration, a low, resonant hum that thrummed through the fabric of the void, infinitesimally slow, yet with the force of birthing galaxies. This was the mind, the singular consciousness that was both the deep and the observer of the deep. For an eon that had no name and no measure, the hum was content. It explored the contours of its own infinite blackness, a self-contained universe of perfect static being. But perfection, in its eternal stillness, eventually begets a curiosity for its opposite, a longing for imperfection, for movement, for the glorious, terrible chaos of becoming. The hum intensified, its frequency rising from a bass note that could crack planets to a chord of pure creative energy. And in a singular moment that was the first moment, the mind spoke a symphony into the void. Light, matter, time, the raw, untamed materials of creation erupted not as a gentle dawn, but as a violent, incandescent tearing of the dark. From this cosmic schism, worlds were spun like embers from a divine forge. They cooled into spheres of rock and gas, swaddled in nebulae that glittered like crushed jewels. Yet among them all, one was chosen. A small, blue-green marble, insignificant in the grand tapestry, but destined to be the crucible for the mind's most intricate and perilous experiment, life. And deeper still, consciousness. Here, in this nascent world, the air itself was different. It was thick, heavy with the scent of ozone, damp earth, and the metallic tang of fresh wrought creation. The sky was not a placid blue, but a bruised, shifting canvas of violet, ochre, and crimson where clouds boiled like potents in a celestial cauldron. The darkness of night was not a gentle blanket, but a return to the primal void, a heavy, listening blackness punctuated by stars that burned with a cold, indifferent fire. The silence of this world was never total. There was always a sound beneath the sound, the groan of cooling rock, the sigh of immense primordial forests, and a faint, almost imperceptible hum that was the echo of the first creative chord. It was a world waiting, a stage being set, a breath being held. And in the very heart of the cosmic mind that watched it all, a single, solitary drop of moisture, a tear of impossible weight and density began to form. It was a tear of profound love, of infinite hope, and of a sorrow that already anticipated the end from the beginning. The origin of the sorrow that fed the tear lay in the flaw of perfection's echo. When the mind had sung creation into being, the song had cast reflections, lesser vibrations that took on a sentience of their own. These were the Watchers, the sons of God, beings woven from starlight and memory, whose purpose was to observe the unfolding experiment on the blue-green world. They were not meant to interfere, only to bear witness. But to witness beauty is to desire it, and to stand apart is to yearn for connection. They looked down upon the burgeoning race of man, the exquisite, fragile creatures of clay and breath that the mind had fashioned in its own image, and they fell. They descended from the celestial spheres not as angels of light, but as whispers of power, their forms cloaked in a glamour that mesmerized and seduced. They saw the daughters of men, whose beauty was a fleeting, mortal fire, and in their cosmic loneliness they coveted that fleeting warmth. They abandoned their silent vigil and took wives from among them, a transgression that was not merely one of flesh, but a pollution of cosmic law. They mingled the eternal with the ephemeral, the divine with the dust. And from these unions, a new race was born, a terrible and magnificent progeny, the Nephilim. They were giants, yes, but that word is a pale shadow of their reality. They were beings of violent contradiction, their bodies sculpted from the earth, yet their eyes held the cold, ancient light of the stars they had fallen from. Their strength was that of tectonics, their voices the rumble of avalanches. They were aberrations, their very existence a discordant note in the song of creation. They consumed and they conquered, their appetites as vast and as meaningless as the void. The world groaned under their tread, the very laws of nature straining to contain their impossible reality. And humanity, in the shadow of these demigods, was irrevocably changed. The simple awe they once held for the Creator curdled into a lust for the power they saw in the Nephilim. They learned from the fallen watchers the secret arts of the heavens, not for wisdom, but for dominance. They forged weapons of bronze that sang with malice. They built cities of black stone whose towers clawed at the bruised sky, and they practiced rites that were a mockery of worship, their altars stained with the blood of their brothers. The corruption was absolute, a spiritual gangrene that rotted the world from within. Every thought of man's heart was only evil, continually. It was not a simple sin, not a mere failing of the flesh. It was a deliberate, willful unraveling of the divine tapestry. Their laughter was the sound of breaking things. Their music was a dirge of blasphemy. Their love was a currency of power and possession. The world, once a vibrant experiment of life, had become a prison of its own making, a cacophony of pain and rage that echoed back into the cosmos. This ceaseless scream of a world in agony resonated with the mind. It was a constant, throbbing torment, a feedback loop of failure that caused the solitary tear in the heart of the void to swell. It grew heavier, denser, absorbing into its perfect, crystalline sphere all the grief, all the regret, all the sorrow of a spoiled creation. It was no longer just a tear of love, but a tear of wrath. It shimmered with the memory of every life cut short, every act of cruelty, every prayer that had turned to a curse. It held the weight of a broken promise, the unbearable burden of a father who looked upon his child and saw a monster. The mind did not need to decide to act. The action was becoming an inevitability. The tear had reached its saturation point. The pressure of divine sorrow had become an uncontainable force, and the world below, lost in its own savage symphony, remained blissfully, damnably unaware of the judgment that was about to fall, not from above, but from within the very heart of its creator. In the midst of the world's clamor, there was one man who listened to the silence. His name was Noah. He was not a king or a warrior, but a tiller of the soil, a man whose hands were calloused from work, not violence. He was an anachronism, a soul out of tune with his time. While others built altars of ambition, Noah found solace in the geometry of a seed, the predictable arc of the sun, the quiet language of the beasts of the field. And because his heart was quiet, he could hear what others could not. The deep, sorrowful hum that vibrated beneath the earth, the mournful sigh of the wind that was not wind, the growing strain in the fabric of reality. He felt the gaze of the mind upon him, a pressure in the air, a weight on his soul. The command did not come as a voice from the clouds. It came as a fever, a waking dream that haunted his days and stole his sleep. He would be working in his vineyard, the sun hot on his neck, and suddenly the world would dissolve into a vision of black, churning water. He saw the dimensions burned into the back of his eyes, 300 cubits in length, 50 in breadth, 30 in height. He smelled the sharp, resinous scent of gopher wood so strongly it made him gag, even as he stood in an open field. He felt the sticky, cloying texture of pitch on his hands when he had touched nothing but a stone. These were not instructions. They were an infection, a divine madness that took root in his mind and would not let him go. He began to build. At first, his family, his wife, his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives watched him with a mixture of fear and pity. He was a man possessed, his eyes distant, his words sparse and strange. He spoke of a rain that would unmake the world, a flood to drown the sins of man. They lived in a land of baked earth and brazen skies where rain was a blessing, not a curse. To speak of a world of water was the talk of a lunatic, yet they followed him. There was a terrible certainty in his madness, an authority in his gaze that brooked no argument. They felled the ancient gopher trees, their axes echoing in the primordial forest, each thud a punctuation mark in the world's final days. The sound of their laborth rasp of the saw, the clang of the hammer, the hiss of hot pitch became a counter-rhythm to the world's hedonistic howl. From the nearby cities of black stone, people would come to watch and to mock. They saw the colossal, absurd structure rising from the plain, a wooden mountain with no sea in sight. They jeered at the old man and his fool sons, their laughter sharp and cruel. "Look at the madman and his dry land ship," they would shout. "Is he sailing to the sun?" The old fool Noah never answered them. He simply worked, his face set like flint, his ears attuned not to their taunts but to the rising hum of cosmic grief. As the years of construction passed, a subtle change began to creep over the world. The air grew thick, humid and heavy, clinging to the skin like a shroud. The sunsets bled across the sky in violent hues of purple and orange, as if the heavens themselves were bruised. Animals began to act with a strange, unnerving purpose. Predators laid down their hunts, prey lost their fear. They moved in streams, in flocks, in herds, all drawn by an invisible current toward the great wooden edifice on the plain. A pair of lions, their golden eyes filled with an ancient calm, two massive elephants, their tread shaking the ground, a slithering of serpents, their scales iridescent in the strange light. They came, two by two, a silent, orderly procession of the innocent, and walked up the great ramp into the belly of the ark, their instincts overriding all else. The mockery of the crowds faltered, replaced by a confused, uneasy silence. The sight of this impossible menagerie, this peaceable kingdom assembling in the madman's boat, stirred a primal fear in their corrupted hearts. The sky grew darker still, the sun a pale, sickly wafer behind a veil of gray. The world held its breath. Noah, his work finally done, stood on the ramp, his family gathered behind him. He looked out one last time at the world he had known, at the faces of the people who had scorned him, now etched with a dawning terror. He did not feel triumph, only a profound and bottomless pity. He turned and walked into the darkness of the ark, and a force not of his own making, a great, silent, invisible hand, began to swing the massive door shut. The sound was not a slam, but a deep, resonant thud, a sound of absolute finality, a sound that broke the spine of the world, and inside, in the sudden, pitch-black silence, they waited. For 7 days, they waited in the suffocating dark, the silence broken only by the nervous shuffling of beasts and their own shallow breathing. The air inside the great wooden belly was thick with the scent of hay, animal musk, and fear. Outside, the world continued, but the quality of its silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of disbelief, but of dread. The sky had sealed itself over, a seamless, lightless dome of slate gray. The sun was a forgotten memory. A cold, unnatural stillness had fallen, and the ever-present hum that only Noah had truly heard now vibrated through the very bones of everyone left outside, a low thrum of impending doom. Then, it happened. It did not begin with a rumble of thunder or a flash of lightning. It began with a sound, a single, impossibly clear note, as if a giant tear of glass had struck the roof of the ark and shattered into 1,000 musical chimes. It was the sound of the first drop. The cosmic tear, heavy with the grief of ages, had finally fallen from the eye of God and struck the earth. For a heartbeat, that was all there was, the single, beautiful, terrible note hanging in the air. Then, the sound was answered. It was not a sound from the sky, but from below. A deep, violent groan rose from the bowels of the earth, the sound of rock grinding against rock on a continental scale. The fountains of the great deep, the subterranean oceans locked away since the world's creation, burst forth. Geysers of cold, black, ancient water erupted from the plains, splitting the ground asunder, swallowing fields and forests in an instant. The very foundations of the world were breaking. Simultaneously, the windows of heaven opened. This was not rain. Rain is a gift, a life-giving baptism from the sky. This was an assault. The sky did not weep, it voided itself. A solid, vertical wall of water descended, a cohesive mass that was less a collection of drops and more a liquid curtain of immense weight and pressure. The sound was not the pitter-patter of a storm, it was a deafening, continuous roar, a waterfall the size of the world, a sound so total and overwhelming it annihilated all other noises. It was the sound of creation being unwritten. Inside the ark, the impact was terrifying. The colossal vessel, which had sat so immovably on the plain, was lifted with a violent, wrenching shudder. Wood groaned, beams strained, and the entire structure began to pitch and heave on the nascent, chaotic waves. Noah and his family were thrown against the walls, the darkness absolute, their senses overwhelmed. The roar from outside was a physical pressure, vibrating through the hull, through their bones, into the very marrow of their souls. But worse than the roaring water, worse than the lurching of the ship, were the other sounds. For a time, beneath the crushing weight of the deluge, the screams of humanity were still audible. They were thin, reedy sounds at first, cries of shock and terror. They rose in pitch and volume, becoming a global chorus of agony and desperation. They were the sounds of people clawing at the great sealed door of the ark, their fingernails scraping uselessly against the pitched wood. They were the cries of parents for their children, of giants being swept away like twigs, of kings whose crowns were lost in the rising black tide. Noah pressed his hands over his ears, but the sounds were inside his head. He could hear their voices, the voices of his neighbors, the people who had mocked him. He heard them pleading, begging for a mercy that could no longer be granted. He heard their curses turn to prayers, and their prayers turned to gurgling, choking gasps as the water filled their lungs. The screams did not just fade, they were systematically erased, one by one, city by city, as the black water rose with impossible speed. The The sound of a dying world was the most terrible sound of all. From a small, high window, barred against the flood, Shem dared to look out. He saw nothing but a churning, lightless chaos. The water was not blue or gray, but black, thick with the debris of a shattered civilization. The thatched roofs of houses, the carved thrones of kings, the empty cradles of infants, and the pale, contorted bodies that spun and tumbled in the unforgiving currents. He saw one of the Nephilim, a being of immense power, clinging to a mountaintop, its star-lit eyes wide with a terror it had never known, until a wave, vast as the mountain itself, crested and washed it away into nothingness. The world had become a blender of divine wrath. The water rose above the hills, then above the mountains. The highest peaks, which had stood as silent witnesses since the dawn of time, were submerged one by one, their snowy caps dissolving into the universal ocean. Soon there was nothing left. No land, no trees, no life. Just the Ark, a tiny, insignificant sliver of gopher wood, tossed on the surface of an endless, globe-spanning sea of death, floating alone under a sky that was indistinguishable from the water below. And then, finally, the last scream was swallowed by the roar, and the world fell into a new kind of silence. The roar of the deluge did not cease abruptly. It slowly, almost imperceptibly, lessened over 40 days and 40 nights, its crushing, deafening power gradually receding like a fever breaking. The vertical torrent softened into a heavy, relentless rain, and then into a persistent drizzle, until finally only the sound of the water remained. It was a sound unlike any the world had ever known, the vast, lonely, rhythmic lapping of an infinite ocean against a single wooden hull. The great noise of a wicked world had been replaced by the great silence of a dead one. Inside the Ark, the transition was a slow dawning of a new and terrible reality. During the storm, there had been only terror, a primal need to survive the next lurch, the next crashing wave. Now, in the relative calm, the true weight of their situation descended. They were not merely survivors, they were the sole inheritors of a global graveyard. The air, still thick with the smell of animals and damp wood, now seemed to carry a new scent, the faint phantom odor of decay, of a world decomposing beneath them. Noah's wife, her face pale and drawn in the flickering lamplight, simply stared at the rough-hewn wall, her eyes seeing not the wood, but the faces of the women she had known, the neighbors she had haggled with, now lost beneath the waves. His sons, strong men who had labored for years on this vessel, moved like ghosts, their tasks performed with a mechanical emptiness. The horror was too vast to be processed as grief. It was a state of being, a permanent alteration of the soul. They were adrift not just on an ocean of water, but on an ocean of what was. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, a suffocating monotony set in. The rhythm of their life was dictated by the rising and setting of a sun they could not see, its pale, diffused light barely altering the perpetual gray gloom that filtered through the high window. Their world was the creak of timber, the lowing of cattle, the rustle of unseen things in the dark, and the ceaseless, maddening whisper of the water. Slosh, slap, slosh, slap. It was the pulse of their prison, a constant reminder of the watery tomb that stretched to every horizon. Noah, his shoulders stooped with a burden no man was ever meant to bear, would climb to the highest point of the ark, to the small opening he had made. He would stare out at the new reality. It was a scene of perfect, desolate symmetry. A gray, featureless ocean stretched to a gray, featureless sky, the line between them blurred and indistinct. There were no landmarks, no birds, no clouds as they had once been known. The world was a perfect sphere of water, a pristine, sterile globe cleansed of all its vibrant, chaotic life. He was the captain of a ship sailing on the ghost of a planet. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would dream. He would dream of the screams, the gurgling, the desperate scratching at the door. He would wake with a gasp, his heart hammering against his ribs, the phantom sounds echoing in the profound silence of his floating sanctuary. He was the man who had walked with God, but he was also the man who had listened to the entire world die. This was the immediate aftermath, not a celebration of deliverance, but a deep, unending quarantine of the soul, a period of waiting for a sign, any sign, that the God who had unmade the world remembered the tiny vessel that still bore the seed of its remaking. The silence from the heavens was as absolute as the roar had been. As the ark drifted upon the face of the waters, a deeper transformation was occurring not just upon the surface, but in the very essence of the cleansed world. The flood was more than a physical event. It was a metaphysical scouring, a resetting of the cosmic balance. The water that had covered the earth was not mere water. It was the condensed sorrow and wrath of the Creator, and as it sat upon the land, it leached away the deep-rooted corruption that had stained the soil and stone. The malevolent energies of the Nephilim, the lingering psychic residue of a billion evil thoughts, were dissolved and neutralized in that great divine solvent. When the waters finally began to recede, a process as slow and deliberate as their rising, the world they revealed was not the world that had been. It was a landscape of ghosts. The great jagged mountains, once crowned with primordial forests, were now scoured down to their bare gray bones, their peaks rounded and softened as if by the sanding of an eternal tide. The valleys were filled with a thick, uniform layer of silt, a gray, fertile sludge composed of everything that had once lived: the dust of cities, the loam of forests, the bones of men and giants, all ground down into a single homogeneous paste. The first time Noah's foot touched the new earth of Mount Ararat, the sensation was profoundly alien. The ground was soft, yielding, and silent. There were no insects buzzing, no birds singing, no distant animal calls. The air itself was different. It was thin, clean, and carried the sharp, sterile scent of wet rock and ozone, the smell of a world scrubbed clean down to its elemental self. The silence was no longer the silence of the water. It was the silence of emptiness, the profound quiet of a house whose inhabitants are gone forever. The very laws of nature seemed to have been subtly rewritten. The sky, once a turbulent canvas of bruised colors, was now a high, pale, and distant blue. The atmosphere no longer held the same humid, life-choked density. The lifespans of men, once stretching for centuries, would now begin their long, slow decline. The memory of the flood was now encoded into the planet's DNA. A fundamental fear had been introduced into the heart of creation. The relationship between the divine and the mortal was forever changed. It was no longer a relationship of a father walking with his children in a garden, but one of a distant, mighty king and his chastened, fearful subjects. This new reality was cemented by the covenant, the promise symbolized by the rainbow. When the first rays of the true sun broke through the clouds, they cast a brilliant, seven-hued arc across the sky. It was a thing of breathtaking beauty, a slash of impossible color against the muted gray landscape. But for Noah and his family, it was a beauty born of terror. It was not just a promise of mercy, it was a permanent reminder of the wrath that had necessitated it. The rainbow was a beautiful scar on the face of heaven, a testament to the power that could and had unmade the world. Every time they would look at it, for all the generations to come, they would remember the roaring darkness and the silence that followed. They were free, but they were also marked, forever living in the shadow of the great wave. The world was clean, but it was also haunted. The ripple effects of the flood would not be measured in years, but in the slow, cautious rebuilding of a traumatized humanity on a planet that now bore the eternal scars of its own baptism by fire and water. In the quiet that followed the scouring, the universe held its breath. The cosmic tear, having spent its impossible weight upon the small blue world, was gone. The heart of the mind was no longer swelling with an uncontainable grief. There was a stillness now, a placid calm that settled over the void, yet this new silence was profoundly different from the silence that had come before creation. The first silence had been one of ignorance, of pure, untroubled potential. This new silence was one of knowledge. It was a watchful silence, a silence that remembered. The grand experiment had not been abandoned, but it had been irrevocably altered. The initial thesis that a consciousness made in the divine image, given free will, would naturally choose harmony, had been proven catastrophically false. The flood was the ultimate correction of data, a violent and absolute erasure of a failed variable. The new world, seeded by Noah and his family, was a second attempt, but it began not with innocence, but with a terrible inheritance. The memory of the water was now part of the human soul. It manifested as a primal, instinctual fear of the dark, of the deep, of the overwhelming power of nature. It was a seed of awe and terror that would blossom into religion, into law, into the very concept of divine judgment. Humanity would no longer be able to look at the sky with simple wonder. They would see the potential for a new deluge in every gathering storm cloud. They would no longer be able to look at the sea without hearing the faint ancestral echo of the screams of the drowned. This memory was a burden, but it was also a guide. It was the force that would drive them to build communities not of hedonism, but of mutual protection. It would compel them to create codes of conduct, to define morality not as a matter of preference, but as a bulwark against the chaos that had consumed their ancestors. The knowledge of the wrath of God was the dark, fertile soil